There is a band of women, and to our manor born, emerging from the darkness past and looking toward the morn. Their mothers labored, waited through a night without a star. The morning shows a suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. Hurrah, hurrah, for equal rights, hurrah, hurrah, for the suffrage flag that bears the woman's star. This band is for all reforms, where shall be at an end. Bayonets and swords shall...
I'm Sarah Piccini. I'm the Assistant Director of the Lackawanna Historical Society, if you don't know who I am. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the suffrage movement in Scranton. I have a PowerPoint with some images from Scranton, some newspaper clippings, and just some other pieces from the Society's collection that help give you an idea of how the story played out in Scranton. To start off with a little bit of context. In general, the official start of the suffrage movement in the United States dates to the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, as it was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. It was built as a gathering to discuss the social, civic, and religious conditions and the rights of women. It was open to both women and men. It was a much bigger deal than it seems today. At the time, it was wildly inappropriate for women to speak in mixed company. They called groups of mixed audiences with men and women were promiscuous groups. So just the idea that women were speaking in public in front of men was a pretty radical idea, even before you got into what they were saying. On the second day of the convention, there were more men in the audience than there had been the day before, and they got a little concerned about the propriety of it. And Lucretia Mott actually asked her husband James if he would chair the convention for that day from that point on, just because there were so many men and what they were doing was so very radical. It was an extraordinary scenario just to start with. At the time, a woman's position was still rooted in the 16th century English common law. A single woman or a femme sole was entitled to own property and sign contracts in her own name, but a married woman was a femme covert who was covered or entirely subsumed by her husband. Under the principle called coverture, a husband and wife are one person in the law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Women couldn't own property, certainly couldn't vote, couldn't really do anything on their own without with the permission of their husband, or without having it take place under his name and his authority. Further, along with the legal definition, Charles Darwin claimed that evolution made women inferior to men. Was based on an animal comparison and the idea that men only survived if they're physically and intellectually superior to others, whereas women only had to be sexually attractive. Darwin inspired E.H. Clarke, who was a physician and faculty member of the Harvard Medical School from 1855 to 1872, to publish his best-selling Sex and Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls, in 1884. The title of the book is a little bit misleading. It's not actually about a fair chance to women at all. Clarke explained that girls would not be able to withstand the intellectual demands traditionally placed on boys in school, and that extensive study would be detrimental to women's health, causing nervous collapse, hysteria, and sterility. So, no school for you. Stay home quietly by yourself, lest you become infertile and sterile. One of the interesting things as part of this that I came across as I was doing the research, obviously it was a movement led by women, directed by women, but in almost every newspaper reference, they're all referred to by their husbands' names. In Lackawanna County, the name that comes up most often was Mrs. Maxwell Chapman. She was the director of the Equal Suffrage League and the Women's Suffrage the Equal Franchise League and the Women Franchise Party, but she's always Mrs. Maxwell Chapman. Sometimes she gets to be Kate. Sometimes their first names do appear, but generally they're Mrs. Maxwell Chapman, Mrs. Worthington Scranton, Mrs. C.S. Weston, Mrs. R.W. Archibald. They're all, again, covered by their husbands. They don't have first names or identities of their own. Another bit of context in the background, the difference between suffragist and suffragette. They are actually two different terms that meant different things. The distinction over time has kind of blurred and been smushed together. But the word suffrage itself comes from the Latin root that initially meant ballot or the right to vote. Anyone advocating for the right to vote, whether they were a man or a woman, black or white, was a suffragist. The term suffragette was coined by a British tabloid newspaper around 1905 as a diminutive form of the word suffragist and a way to mock women. Some British women embraced the term and turned suffragette to their advantage to define a more militant type of activism, while non-confrontational suffragettes continue to try to sway public opinion with words rather than deeds. The suffragettes were the women who have become immortalized as iron-jawed angels since then. Emmeline Pankhurst, who was imprisoned many times, went on hunger strikes, and a personal favorite who I kind of discovered randomly, Marian Mullin, who was an Irish suffragette in 1915, who followed Winston Churchill around while he was campaigning for Parliament and rang a bell every time he spoke. She sounded kind of fun. In the United States, the term suffragette kept its derogatory connotations and was not really embraced by the movement. They tended to be suffragists in public, but it was still often bandied about by opponents of the movement as a way to kind of, again, denigrate women. In the Scranton newspapers, however, both terms kind of seem to be interchangeable a lot of times, and suffragette is used almost as often as suffragist and without really any kind of negative connotation or subtext attached to it. As I said, over time, the distinction between the two has kind of blended and faded. I will probably use them interchangeably just because I'm more used to saying suffragette rather than suffragist. But you understand what I mean as I'm going. All right. As I'm going to go through, I'll talk a little bit about the arguments for and against, and then specific instances and specific figures in the history of suffrage in Scranton. The arguments in favor of votes for women are relatively simple to understand. They're not all that different from the rallying cries used in the American Revolution. Basically, it's no taxation without representation. Suffragettes' arguments were based on the ideas of justice and expediency. The continued disenfranchisement of women meant ignoring the country's Republican ideals of citizenship and the concept of individual liberty. Also, the theory that government is based on the consent of the governed. If women had no voice in the government, how fair could it possibly have been? To fight for suffrage was a just cause. It was a logical step in the political process. Further, suffragettes argued for expediency. They argued that voting would allow women to fully fulfill their duties of citizenship and represent their collective interests. Women, they believed, would fill a moral void in the electorate. If women voted, quote, there would be a purer and sweeter political atmosphere. Honor, manliness, efficiency, and probity would become prerequisites for office, while corrupt, venal men would be eliminated as political factors. It seemed like a good idea, good theory in 1912. The growing number of women's clubs and the spreading of the temperance movement helped to move suffrage activism into the mainstream because it kind of eased women into the public sphere and out of the home. It allowed them to work on charitable and moral causes rather than jumping fully right into politics. Both women's clubs and the temperance idea promoted the idea of municipal housekeeping, which has become one of my favorite terms that I've discovered in this process, was the idea of female moral support and the maternal instinct for a better society. The temperance movement was led mainly by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, saw the influx of moral votes from women as a key to passing dry legislation, and noted that it was the duty of women to be personally interested in righteous laws. Anti-suffragettes clung to the idea of the Jacksonian idea of the cult of true womanhood. It seems wild today that there were women who were against voting in the first place, but they had an idea that kind of is still leveled a lot at women in the political sphere, even in the public sphere in general today. They believed that a woman's place was in the home, and that motherhood was a noble patriotic duty, and that if they raised their sons to be moral, upstanding gentlemen, then their work was done, and they really had no need to dirty their hands in politics themselves. Victorians separated the world into the public sphere of business and politics as the domain of men, and the domestic sphere of the home and family as the bastion of refinement and relaxation maintained by women. The Anti-Suffrage League stated that a woman shouldn't bother herself with current political issues and that women have all the responsibilities and opportunities they can use advantageously, and that political preoccupations offer her no solution to the problems with which she has to contend as a woman. So politics cannot help you bake a cake or raise your child, theoretically. Antis fought against what they called the burden of the ballot, claiming that women were already overburdened as mothers and should be exempt from the duty of voting, much the same way that they were already exempt from military service. Further, they argued that giving women the right to vote was redundant. Same idea, if they raised their sons to be good citizens, they didn't have to get involved themselves. However, one of the favorite answers that I found to this, very simple. Suffragettes in Scranton had a very, very simple answer. They said, if the antis are so concerned with the woman's place being in the home, why don't they just stay home? Rather than coming out in public and speaking against us, just go back home and concern yourself with your house and your family. The paradox of this led to political cartoons in national magazines decrying what would happen to men if women went out to vote. They might be required to watch the children, help with the housework. Horror of horrors. Suffragettes in Scranton met this issue head on, and they opened a suffrage restaurant on Adams Avenue in 1913. Suffrage restaurant in Adams Avenue in 1913. It was staffed by volunteers. They worked as cooks, cashiers, and waitresses. They served lunch to around 200 patrons a day for 15 cents. Seems like a pretty good deal. Kate Chapman, again, the leader of the Equal Franchise League in Scranton, explained the restaurant was specifically designed to stop that criticism of the idea that suffragettes had no place in the home. They had no motherly skills or domestic skills themselves, so they had to go out and interfere in the world of men. The restaurant was there to prove that suffragettes can actually cook. But the debate back and forth about a woman's role was neatly encapsulated in a literal debate that took place in Greenridge between female members of the Equal Franchise League, among them Kate Chapman, Mrs. E.L. Walters, and Annie Manchester, against male members of the Greenridge Post of the Patriotic Order's Sons of America in 1915. As the cartoon shows, was drawn by William Stengi, who kind of mocked and parodied an awful lot of prominent figures in Scranton, but he seems to show that women carried the day. Although he does note at the end of his article that one of the judges of the debate, an attorney Woodruff, noted that he had to come down in favor of women, mainly because he lived with so many women in his house and he would be in trouble if he didn't. The history of women's suffrage in Scranton, like the history of so many things, is similar to and slightly wilder than the national story. The first woman to vote in Scranton before there was even a formal organized movement locally was a woman named Rose Kane, who voted on February 15th, 1898. The newspaper unfortunately spelled her name wrong. They were so scandalized that a woman had the audacity to go vote. They couldn't quite get her name right. But I did find her in the census. She's Rose Kane, K-A-N-E, rather than C-A-I-N. But she walked into a polling place in Scranton's 20th Ward, showed the officials her naturalization papers, and cast her vote in front of what the paper called awe-stricken men, declaring her right to vote as an American citizen. The Scranton Times report, although they spelled her name wrong, has a complete sense of how odd they were. If you look at the beginning of the article, it says, a woman, clad in customary female attire, cast her maiden vote yesterday afternoon. This was astonishing. The following year, Mrs. Kane herself ran for office. She was attempting to oust longtime school board member John Gibbons. Unfortunately, she received only 41 votes to Gibbons' 625, but she tried. She was kind of the first one to go out there. The next one is a little bit more colorful, kind of become another one of my new favorites that I've discovered. Anna Maquette Branda ran for mayor of Scranton in 1906. It takes a certain type of woman to run for mayor of one of Pennsylvania's largest cities more than a decade before women had any idea of political participation. Anna Branda was loved by newspaper editors as a colorful confrontation with landlords and the police. Previously, in 1898, she had been institutionalized in the Hillside Home, was an insane asylum locally. I don't get a set reason for why, but she's kind of a colorful character. Went from the hillside home, but one of her early claims to fame was a lawsuit where she successfully sued a mover for $150 over a disagreement over a 25-cent fee. Further, she visited Carrie Nation when she was in jail in Scranton in 1901 and challenged voters in the 16th Ward polling place during the 1904 presidential election, hoping to convert them to socialists and vote for Eugene Debs. In 1906, she ran for mayor on the socialist ticket, promising to end cronyism and oversee a nonpartisan administration. She also advocated for citywide street paving, more parks and streetlights, and the creation of a school for adults to learn English. So, not a wild campaign platform. Seems fairly reasonable, but again, she was unsuccessful. She received only a handful of votes, and then unfortunately, her misfortune was compounded further. She was arrested for vagrancy a few days after the election. She moved to Philadelphia in the years later and continued her fight. She did plan to run for announced a plan to run for governor of Pennsylvania in 1910, but then nothing ever came of it, and she just kind of dwindles out of history, but colorful early character. More reasonably, suffragettes started to focus on the school board as a way for women to participate in the political sphere in a more acceptable way. The cult of true womanhood placed women squarely in the domestic sphere with the home and the family, but school boards offered a way to kind of bridge that gap between the public and the private. Early candidates for school board were unsuccessful. Catherine DeLacy Roach ran in 1911, and Adele Musselman and Bella Glinsky in 1913. Various women's organizations teamed up to support the candidacy of Mrs. Walter Hill and Miss Mary Fay in 1917. They formed a centralized committee for door-to-door campaigning and public rallies. On election day, members of the committee staffed the polling places and also later stood guard over the votes that were stored in a locked safe in the Prothonotary's office. They were taking no chances in their campaigns and their balloting. Despite many reports of vote tampering to keep the women out of office, both women were successful and won the election by narrow margins. Unfortunately, their tenure on the board was brief. Miss Fay was a victim of the Spanish flu pandemic in October of 1918, and Mrs. Hill stepped down the following year in March of 1919, citing a weakened condition from the same flu. So they were successful. They were in office for about a year or so, and then both were victims of the Spanish flu. I mentioned before Kate Chapman. Suffrage in Scranton was very well organized. Chapman was the founder of the Lackawanna County Equal Franchise League and a branch of the Women's Suffrage Party. The first mentions that appear in Scranton newspapers are around 1913, when the parties were formed in Scranton. The women held rallies, handed out literature, and actively supported candidates in favor of suffrage. In 1914, suffragettes converged on the city for the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association convention at the Hotel Casey. It was led by the Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and Kate Chapman in Lackawanna County. The convention women discussed plans for canvassing and voter registration, announced civil positions that were open to women, and also featured exhibitions explaining home management and pure and impure foods and drugs. Had to kind of still temper the domesticity of it a little bit. But most interestingly, each female attendee was encouraged to convince 10 men to vote in favor of equal suffrage. This is one of our favorite photos. It's the committee attendees in 1914 standing in front of the Hotel Casey in Scranton, but they're holding their banner for votes for women. And in Lackawanna County, their goal was at least successful. In 1915, Pennsylvania put the question of amending the state constitution to allow women to vote on the ballot. Obviously, the women themselves couldn't vote in this issue. They still had to convince men to vote for them, to allow them to vote. Kind of kept getting lost on me when I was doing the research. It was an interesting concept that they're putting all of this work into this effort and still can't actually vote for it themselves. But the measure passed in Lackawanna County by a margin of more than 2,500 votes. Similar victories were declared in Luzerne, Wayne, and Susquehanna counties as well. Unfortunately, the measure failed statewide, and women would have to wait another 5 years for the ratification of the 19th Amendment to gain the vote. However, in the Scranton Republican, Kate Chapman published an open letter thanking the press and the voters for their support, saying noting especially the noble men and women who put aside their shrinking to speak in public in support of suffrage, and acknowledged men and women who had volunteered at the polls, some of whom lost their jobs for doing so. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and women were able to move fully into the political sphere. In Lackawanna County, there's 2 women who kind of stand out as early women who were involved in the process the whole way. Marian Marjorie Scranton and Marian Mullin. They're a Republican and a Democrat, one who served as advisor and committee woman, and another who held elected office. Marian Marjorie Warren was the granddaughter of the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, who married into Scranton's founding family when she married Worthington Scranton in 1906. She created her own legacy as a prominent Republican activist as she continued through her life. Marjorie was involved in politics from the age of 16, attending the Republican National Convention and traveling on her own to Harrisburg to picket the state legislature. She remained active in suffragette circles after her marriage, working with Kate Chapman and others in Scranton. To picketed the state legislature, she remained active in suffragette circles. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, she jumped right in. She was a member of the Republican State Committee from 1922 to 1934, the vice chair of the Pennsylvania Republican Party from 1926 to 28, a delegate to the Republican National Convention for 6 consecutive presidential elections, a member of the Republican National Committee from 1928 to 51, and the vice chair of the Republican National Committee from 1936 to 38. At the time, that was the highest party post offered to a woman in American politics. She was a charismatic female spokesperson for the Republican Party, frequently appearing at rallies and other events, as well as speaking about women in politics on talk radio in Scranton. Marjorie died June 23rd, 1960, 2 years before her son Bill was elected governor of Pennsylvania. In the years after her death, many Republican women's groups honored her as an icon and namesake, including Lackawanna County's Marjorie Scranton Council of Republican Women. Marian Mullin was the first woman in Lackawanna County who was elected to the Pennsylvania legislature, but she had been active in Democratic politics before taking office. In the 1920s, she served as secretary for U.S. Congressman Patrick Bolin and led Al Smith's presidential campaign in Scranton. In 1928, she organized the first Democratic Women's Club in Scranton. Marian's father-in-law and her husband had both served in the legislature. When her husband died in 1947, Marian campaigned in a special election to fill his seat. She was successful and then moved into a solid career in the legislature on her own. She was elected in 1947 with 73% of the vote and remained in the House for 9 terms after that. Marian enjoyed a number of firsts. She was the first woman elected as secretary of the House Democratic Caucus in 1963. She was the first and only woman ever elected to the office of Secretary of the House of Representatives, making her Pennsylvania's first female legislative officer in the House. She served as secretary of and only woman on the Powerful Appropriations Committee. While in office, Marian was a leading advocate for the interest of labor in Pennsylvania, but she claimed that her greatest accomplishment as a legislator was in the sponsorship of House Bill No. 66, prohibiting pay discrimination based on gender. It was signed into law in 1959 by Governor David L. Lawrence. She was an active lifelong member of many party and community organizations, including Democratic clubs in Blakely, German, Mayfield, and the Young Democrats of Lackawanna County, the American Legion Auxiliary, and the Girl Scouts of America. Marian retired from the House in 1965, when her district was combined with another during reapportionment. She left behind a remarkable legacy of government service. Following her death on September 15, 1983, her sons James and Robert presented a portrait of her to House Speaker K. Leroy Urbis. On March 11, 1987, family and friends gathered for an unveiling of the portrait in the House of Representatives. Governor Robert P. Casey proclaimed it Marian Mullin Day. When Marian Mullin took office in 1947, it was revolutionary. However, since then, many other Lackawanna County women have stepped in and moved into politics. We're even claiming Hillary Clinton as the first woman who nominated for president by a major political party who has Scranton roots. In 1997, Trish Corbett was elected the first female judge in Lackawanna County, Lorraine Cummings became the first female county commissioner in 2016, and most recently, Paige Cognetti was elected as the first female mayor of Scranton just last year. So she's a very convenient end for my suffrage tale. There have always been women in Lackawanna County who are active in politics, who are moving forward and hoping to find a better way for them and take a more active role. So we continue moving forward as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of suffrage. Stay tuned. We will send out emails again next week. Our Zoom program will be a visit from Civil War General Winfield Scott. So we'll go back a little further in time next week, and we'll see how that goes. So thank you for tuning in.
Evolves the grandest triumph of dual human race. Church and state, the home and school, and law and love embrace. We'll have a perfect nation, we'll march from near and far, to glory neath the stars and stripes that shall bear the woman's star. Hurrah, hurrah, for equal rights, hurrah, hurrah, for the stars and stripes that shall bear the woman's star.